From the museum in Washington, D.C., this is Power to the Interns. Now we take the employer view. What are employers doing right now in response to the Me Too movement? I'm going to start with someone with a good story to tell at Politico, Tracy Schweikert, VP of HR. You're making some changes.
We are. We are working really hard on culture. It's really important to us. Starting at all different levels of the organization, but also making sure that we do focus on our newest interns. We are making sure that when we talk specifically about harassment or discrimination, that we do classroom training, but that we also do a layering approach. We talk via roundtables. One of the things that I heard from employees early on is, Tracy, yeah, you say you have an open door policy and that's great, but going to the VP of HR is a nuclear option. Who can I go to if I'm not really sure how serious it is? And so what I've done is I've taken the time to train all of my employees, even my recruiting assistants, so that they can be approachable, so that somebody can come to them. And hopefully what we've got is someone that is a little easier to approach across the organization so that everybody feels like they have an outlet.
Well, if it's hard for an employee, imagine what it must be like for an intern or a brand new hire. And I want to turn to Gloria Riviera from ABC News, correspondent, and also one of the founding members of Press Forward. You are among women who have experienced the worst of the sexual harassment, and you want to do something about it, but apparently so does ABC right now.
Absolutely, both organizations. And I can tell you that not only ABC, but every network, as we know, has dealt with this at very high levels. And one of the first things that ABC did was to gather all the senior managers. And they have now taken an approach in which they want every manager from the bottom on up to be an active bystander, to really, that's becoming sort of a trendy word as we discuss this, but really to, when they see something, no matter how big or no matter how small, to say something. And I think it also goes to Tracy's point that everybody has to be an active bystander, and hopefully that will help to break down this fear and anxiety that's completely understandable for interns or new hires or any young person in a news organization to have about, if I report this, will there be a consequence? And ABC has taken a very hard stance against retaliation. They want to make sure that that's something all employees know, and also that there will not be any consequence even if there is exoneration once an investigation is completed. At Press Forward, we have come together because we are all women who have experienced some kind of discrimination or sexual harassment during our time in the news industry. And as we came together this fall in the wake of the Me Too movement, we started to talk about a silver lining. What would that be? What would that look like? And our mission is very much focused on providing men and women, of course, to come through the news industry, to come up through the news industry, knowing they have access to help, knowing that there's a safe and secure environment out there. And we believe that our mission is to help newsrooms across the country change. What do we need to do to change, and how can we affect that change?
And interns are people that you've sort of mentored unofficially over the years, right? What's your concern for them?
You know, news is such a dynamic and always changing industry, and what I have heard as I've talked to executives and talked to my colleagues, certainly at ABC, this is the case. We have the policies, and they are good policies in place. They do exist. But the challenge has been how to make them readily accessible in this business when you can find yourself in one of the 99 counties in Iowa by yourself as a young reporter, alone with an entirely new team that you haven't worked with, that you haven't established trust with. The next week you could be somewhere across an ocean with an entirely new team. So because news is such a quickly changing work environment, how do you make sure that each employee feels safe, whatever the situation may be?
Okay. When we talk about training, one of the concerns that came up both in the EEOC's report and the conversations at the Power Shift, and I talk about the EEOC Master Report from 2016, right, that talked about the fact that there has not been definitive proof that a lot of training has been particularly effective. Why is that?
Well, so the report made a lot of recommendations about how employers and EEOC and members of the public and members of the business and civil rights communities can work together to prevent and address harassment. One set of recommendations did focus on training, and it talked about the fact that the training that had been done was really focused on legal compliance and maybe wasn't as effective as it could be. But the report made some recommendations, and it talked about the importance of having training tailored to the organization. And I think Gloria's point here is very well made, because the news organization is unique in a lot of ways. If you're not in the same building, surrounded by the same people every single day, if you're in the field, if you're working in an isolated environment, if you're working overseas, there are a lot of different risk factors there for harassment. So ensuring that the training, the examples, et cetera, are actually tailored to the situations that employees are going to be in is critical. Ensuring that it's live, or at the very least that it's interactive and engaging, not something where people can tune out or hit next, is also very important.
Live, interactive, and engaging. Okay, so no pressure, Brent Jones, because you're now at the Wall Street Journal, having spent a lot of time previously, most of your life, at USA Today working in the field of ethics and standards, and now you're going to be taking a look at how we bring people on board, including interns. You get to design this.
That's right. And also, I should add, the third prong at USA Today was running a year-round internship program. At the Wall Street Journal, I mean, I think the key two words was just be intentional. I think that one of the things that attracted me to the Journal when coming on board was even how they sort of set up the managing editor's office and separating and focusing on the people part of the newsroom operations in concert with our people team in HR. And then there's the journalism piece. And so you have the pillars within the managing editor's office, Karen Pinciero, who reports right into the top editor. And those four pillars are focusing on training and development, the recruitment aspect, the finance aspect, and logistical aspects of our newsroom operations. And I think that's really important, because as you think about interns and coming in and as you onboard them, you want to not just place students in cubicles and solely think about strictly the workplace experience they're going to get, but you also want to make sure that there's an extension of a learning engagement. And engagement, I think, is really important to the point that you raised about the formal training, sort of the online training that is very easy to zone out of. You want to make sure that we're thinking about what are those levels of high engagement as it relates to orientation, being intentional about expectations. You know, what is it that when I come on board, who are the key people within that organization who are going to help me, especially in a large newsroom? You know, we get used to large newsrooms when you've been in large newsrooms for so long, but we have to keep in mind that that experience of that student on day one, it's overwhelming, it's huge. I mean, I go back to my elementary school, I look back and say, wow, is this, the halls seem smaller now. but when it's the same, we have to keep in mind for that first day, and you really want to make an impression. And I think part of that, we talk about the vulnerability of interns, and part of that comes because the big carrot stick that often dangles is the job, right? You know, it's not always just about the internship, but it really is like, how do I get over this and get the job? And I think that puts a great amount of pressure on students who come in. Again, students who come into our workplace. So what we've done, and previously what I've done, and one of the things, the mandate that's been on me and part of my role, is to really be intentional about programming that creates portals, opportunities for students to be able to engage, understanding that their input matters, not just your work, but your input. And I think that's really important. And from a workplace perspective, not just focusing on onboarding and orientating interns, but who are going to be those slate of individuals who are going to be supervising those interns, mentoring those interns, making sure that there is a clear understanding across the board about who we are as an organization and how we want to make sure that we're representing future journalists. And I really see it as not just a Wall Street Journal responsibility, but an industry responsibility. There's never a guarantee that the person who comes into the Wall Street Journal as an intern is going to work at the Wall Street Journal. But I do think that we want to make sure that we're thinking industry-wide, are we preparing people well? And from an employee perspective on engagement also, we've been doing, our people team has been doing employment engagement surveys, really understanding what are the experiences that are already taking place across the workplace. Before you get to training, you have to understand what are existing experiences. So
Tracy, how do you bring a young person as an intern on board, want to treat them as an adult, right? Which is what we've always done. We've always said, I'm going to treat interns as the same as I would do another, early employee. But now we realize that in thinking about that, we didn't take into account the powerlessness that they had in their effort to want to please, for example, and potentially get a job. So how do we balance treating them as adults and also making sure they're protected?
So our existing intern program at the Washington Post provides, I think, a lot of the layering that Tracy and Brent talked about. We have a lot of opportunities for that kind of interaction, but each intern is married with a professional partner who often is a former intern, him or herself, to understand what that experience is like. The interns obviously are assigned to their own sections, but we bring them together once a week for cross-training purposes. They get to meet with a variety of people in the newsroom so that their experiences are as broad as possible. But if there were one thing that I would want to say, not only to interns or to new employees, but to everyone in every workforce, if something happens to you that makes you feel uncomfortable, say something. It is, you sometimes feel maybe it's just me, but when someone comes to me and says, I had this thing that made me feel uncomfortable, what they don't know is maybe someone else has come to me. And that allows me to connect the dots. It is a courageous thing to come forward, but it makes your institution a stronger institution if you can do that. And it's incumbent upon us to make sure that not only are there not anti-retaliation policies in place, but that it's a reality, that people do feel that their courage is recognized and rewarded.
Let me just go back to Maya. One of the things that we know is that despite in the field of journalism, a lot of young women graduating and supposedly going into the profession, right? We still don't see women and people of color at higher levels in organizations. Something is causing them to opt out. Now, we could say it's the pay, we could say a lot of things, but what about the working conditions? Do you see a connection between harassment, discrimination, and what we called the glass ceiling?
Absolutely. I would say, harassment, different forms of discrimination are just different expressions of power imbalances and gender and racial inequity in workplaces, whether they're newsrooms or restaurants or anywhere else. And these things don't happen in isolation. So if someone is experiencing sexual harassment, it's not unlikely that they're also experiencing pay discrimination or race discrimination. They go together because it's built on inequality and power. So, as a lawyer, it's really, I think about the law a lot and the limits of the law in these situations, which is why it's so important, as Lisa said, for employers to move beyond compliance and thinking about what you would like your workplace to look like and what you would like the culture to be. So it's important to build, as you are thinking about changing, revising, building new systems within your workplace for addressing these issues, that's important for breaking down structural barriers. But then there's the culture piece. You can build the best system, but if no one trusts it, they're not going to come forward and report. They're not going to tell anyone what happened, even if you have multiple points of reporting. So how do you address that culture piece and that trust piece? That's when things will start to change, and when people believe that leadership is really dedicated to dismantling those structures of inequality that block people from advancing in their career and stop women and people of color from deciding that it's easier to just leave the job, leave the field entirely, than try to be the one struggling against this system for change.
And there are a few things that organizations can do to help with culture change, but of course it's something that takes time, and we're talking weeks and months and years and not days and not hours. The first one is obviously a leadership commitment, like you were talking about, with the senior leaders coming together and making a commitment not only to speak up for themselves, but to speak up for others. That is central and something that needs to be repeated. Also, when you're reviewing your policies, procedures, and training, including employees in those conversations, because of course you want to make sure that the training and the policies and procedures are understandable to everyone at all levels of the organization, and you want to make sure that they're realistic. And by including employees in the process, you show that you value their opinions, you create an engaged and informed group of workers and individuals who believe that you are committed to their success and can share their information, can be informal peer advisors to their colleagues.
So we talked about retaliation, but Tracy, sometimes it isn't just as obvious as retaliation. When someone is being evaluated for a promotion or maybe to get that transition from an intern to a full-time job, you may hear someone say something like, oh, kind of touchy person, you know, kind of sensitive, or maybe not a team player. Some ways in which people who have actually brought complaints forward weren't retaliated against so overtly, but we just judged them a little differently. How do you filter for that kind of inherent bias that someone may have because someone who did complain or did say something that said, I don't like what you're doing, seemed overly sensitive?
Well, and I think that's something that has become a big part of what we are trying to do more and more in the workplace in general, right? As we look at the perspective that we bring to a situation and making sure that we're bringing enough people into the conversation so that we can account for some of that. What I typically do in my role is push the conversation further. When you say those words, what do you mean? And sometimes going as far as to say, when I hear the word touchy, that makes me feel like we're not really talking about this person's performance, but we're talking about something else. And calling it out specifically, not letting somebody get by with using language that can be detrimental and they may not even realize that they're doing it. So really making a point of saying, what are you trying to get at with that bit of feedback, including enough people in the conversation to making sure that we're getting a nice balanced perspective.
You work in a field that places a great emphasis on appearance. Television, someone who wants to get hired has to have people say, I like watching that person. Then my question to you is, as especially young women are coming into the workplace and they want to dress for success, can they misread what that dress code should be?
I've seen that happen. So my answer to that is absolutely yes. And having worked abroad for several years, the American standards are so different from the European standards, especially for women, but also for men. It definitely exists for men as well. So I think this goes to the onus being on our young people today entering the news industry. I see a lot of positives and I see some challenges. I do believe that the first question I would ask as an intern entering the news organization, I would start to look in the organization for somebody that I feel comfortable enough to go to say, you've been so gracious with your help. Is it okay if I come to you from time to time if I have anything? Because we're still, it's not going to take hours or weeks. It's going to take months or years. So that is my advice to everyone. Often I have become that person. And I think what we have to remember is these interns are looking for a job. So to find someone in the organization that is secure in their job, who can maybe then take their message forward without the consequences that an intern might feel, that is very important. But people are busy. The onus is on the intern to go into a new situation and start to look at and create the structure they need to succeed.
So how do you tell your employer? Because I know at the Power Shift Summit, one of your colleagues from Press Forward said, you know, you look at some of the ways that women are expected to dress on the air, and a guy is in a suit and tie and a woman is in what looks like a lot more exposed skin. How do you say to your employer, why are you asking me to dress this way?
That's a difficult and uncomfortable situation for many, and I think there are a lot of difficult and uncomfortable situations that we are just going to have to forge ahead right into the middle of them. You are not required to dress in any certain way. There might be pressure that you feel to do so, but in reality, if you do look on the air, you know, there are a lot of variations.
Of women who are dressed just like you.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And so To the young women, I would say that is nobody's concern but your own. And what's important is what you say and what you report. But I do sympathize with the pressure that comes. And it's not just television these days, it's the Facebook Live feeds that you're doing from the field, it's everywhere. So that extra added pressure that we've traditionally associated just with television, I think that's going to be applicable across all platforms.
What do you say, Brent and Tracy, to the people who have said, and I hear it, you know, things have changed, you know, it's not just as much fun anymore. You just can't say anything you want in a newsroom. And, you know, we used to be able to be rough and tumble and, you know, throw things if we were unhappy. And those were the good old days. How do you respond to people who are bemoaning the change?
I think the news industry, like everything else, has changed enormously over time. When I first started at the Washington Post, we published 3 editions a day, and there was no one in the newsroom before 11 o'clock in the morning. We're now a 24/7 operation. The world changes, and you need to get on board with it. And this is just part of that.
Now, you're accustomed to being the standards editor, so you've always been the death of the party. So I say that as someone who teaches ethics. So how do you transition people, truly, from the idea that, oh, come on, you know, you're now controlling speech, you're now controlling thought, everything is quote unquote politically correct? What's the response to that?
You know, I think when you think about the nature of a newsroom, I mean, obviously, you're talking about a lot of journalists. We have questions. We need spaces to have those kinds of conversations and uncomfortable conversations. And I think they need to be framed around the ethical standards that we've set, which includes diverse civil discourse and being able to have an exchange and understand different experiences. I think that it was an earlier point talking even about fear that people have of even sort of raising their hand to talk about issues. If you take it from the perspective as, I have a friend who has this problem, and I think we can do that in the context of journalism because we have some really great stories that are circulating around this topic. They're great opinions. It was a piece, I think it was maybe 2 summers ago in the Times, Sam Polk, a bond trader in Wall Street, wrote about a male perspective. And he was very favorable to a lot of the sentiment that women were expressing. But again, that was a perspective that you could take in a setting and have a conversation. So as we think about the context of interns, creating safe places where they can have those conversations, I think that for interns as well as for our journalists, we need to find vehicles so that those questions can be asked and that we can get clarity. Because in different newsrooms, there are a lot of nuances about what is acceptable. And I think having clear ethical standards as it relates to diverse perspectives and as it relates to the enhancement and the betterment of our coverage, I think are really important, but you've got to create spaces to have those conversations.
I just want to interject because I'm curious what the response might be. How do you create real world, everyday examples inside the newsroom? One example that was brought up from my own workplace was just the words that are used. So when people use phrases in an editorial meeting, such as, oh, so-and-so was hot and bothered, or that it takes somebody standing up then and there, and that might not be an inappropriate touch, but it's emblematic of a tolerance that we want to end. So how do you create a place in which managers and editors are willing to stand up and sort of be the voice that shuts that down?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, I think part of it is having a voice. It is having a seat at the table. And when the front page is put up at a story conference, sort of saying, why are we showing female plebes struggling when we would show male plebes being forthright? And just sort of saying, that picture bothers me and we should think about it. You have, I mean, it's so cliche, but if you see something, say something. You really do have to be an active participant in the change that you want to see. Certainly moving women people of color, people with diverse perspectives up the management chain really matters.
I would just add, going back to the point about the importance of that, of modeling that kind of behavior from leadership and from people who do have power and credibility and who don't have to have that same fear about losing that power and credibility if they speak up on behalf of people. And it's so important to speak up in that moment and shut down comments or behavior that, you know, aren't rising to the level of something illegal, but clearly are making people uncomfortable, are, you know, racist or borderline sexist, that will escalate if you don't shut it down right then and there.
One of the biggest lessons that came out of the Power Shift Summit that I took away was that many people in management who were probably people of goodwill were still looking at any case to the letter of the law. How did what this person did meet the standard of action that we should take some response to? And there are so many things that don't rise to the level of an illegal act. And in obviously what we're talking about, an illegal act would be a quid pro quo. You know, you must have this sexual relationship with me in order to have your job. And that's such a high threshold. And then it usually is a manager, right? What we found now is that there were a lot of very powerful people who weren't managers. They were stars. In the case of ABC, you had a person who was responsible for the political unit who had great power, and a lot of people didn't think they could complain.
A lot of the women that I have spoken with and that have joined me on Press Forward certainly did not feel like there was any point in complaining, and they didn't feel like they knew even where to go. I know that the management has been incredibly dismayed by that and has felt, of course, there was a place to go. So to me, that says there is a disconnect, was a disconnect. And I will tell you, the reason that those women at a certain time found strength is because they talked to each other. And that says to me that see something, say something to whomever it is that you feel comfortable with. Because I certainly look back and the conversations that were going on were not going on because we thought those other women could do something. They were in the same boat with us, but collectively there was strength in numbers. So I think that that's something that I know ABC is working very hard to erase that disconnect by creating more avenues for people to go to. And I think it's very important that those avenues are, you know, the more the better. There can't be too many.
So how has that changed, especially for interns?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, for a long time, one of the reasons we talk about the reason that training fell down is because we did the lowest common denominator when it came to training. We put online training out there and just expected people to use it when we all know that people are clicking next while they're doing their email. We stopped having conversations. And so I think what's really important now is that we have conversations. What we've been doing at Politico is we started in the newsroom and then we branched out to the rest of the organization, and we started with managers first. And we said, let's have a safe conversation. Let me give you a couple of things that we've either seen in the news or that I've heard over my career. Let's talk about that. What do we do when I don't witness it directly? Do I still have an obligation to bring it forward? What if it's coming from that person over there who I know is a gossip? Should I just discount it? And really having a lot of conversations about, you know what, every little thing. Yeah. Anything that's sticking in the back of your mind, I want to know it as the leader in HR. Our editor wants to know about it. Our CEO wants to know about it. Let HR be the one to decide whether or not it's something that we want to do, but let's talk about it.
At the Post, one of the things that I have communicated to managers is this notion that they actually have no discretion. Mm-hmm. If you see something, if somebody says something to you, you don't have the power to determine whether it's significant or not.
Right? Yeah.
It needs to come to me or another managing editor, and I think in some ways that makes it easier for managers. You know,
make it an automatic report.
It's an automatic. You must do it, and then you create a central clearinghouse where you can see where patterns are emerging.
Yeah, and just to build on that, and then thinking through what is that action plan about what we learn. I think it's nothing worse than being invited to engage and things kind of go in a dark hole. So I think that there's also, within our organizations, making sure, again, that we're thinking intentionally about the protocols that we're setting in place. I think it's great, and we all agree we need the people, the pathways, understanding that, but then we need to be creating action plans around those so that people understand that it did matter when I spoke up.
And it's not just day one, right? It's,
That's
you know,
right.
I mean, that's the other thing, right? We give you all this information on day one, but throughout the course of the internship, how are we touching base with you? What else are we talking about?
And feedback, I think, checking the pulse of interns. You're right. Right after day one, what are we doing in terms of soliciting from them and keeping track, and so that we're creating an environment where everybody understands that there is a difference between an intern and a full-time employee.
So some of the scary cases that we've heard about involved people who said, I want to talk to you about your career. I want to mentor you. Let's go out for a drink and talk about it. What are you telling your own employees? We want them to mentor people, but what are you telling them about the boundaries so that we don't, I mean, obviously it's easy to say don't harass, but where's that line?
Well, I mean, I think the fact of the matter is, in many of these cases, it's not that the intern or the employee didn't have an uncomfortable feeling. They just thought they had to go along with it. And so what we're doing is talking to them about, you know what, if something's tingling on the back of your neck, say, you know what, could we just talk in the break room? I'd love to do that. You know, I don't have time to go to coffee.
But what are you telling your own employees, though, that we don't want them to stop mentoring people, right?
Oh, no,
we want Glorias, you know.
But I think as you're giving orientation to those who are supervising and mentoring, I think it is good to talk about, like, what are those areas that we deem more safe zones? Environments that are more in the control of the newsroom environment are safer. Granted, you do have to go outside of the newsroom, but I do think it's helpful to have that conversation, lay out the expectations so that people understand, even from a perception standpoint. It's just safer to think about and to be thinking about locales for meetings, one-on-one versus maybe pulling someone else into the conversation, depending on what the kind of conversation. I think you do want to think about the space. It's really important.
We try to make sure that our intern interactions are in group settings, so that we have, even if it's a fun thing, even if we're going out to Nationals Park, we have the interns, we have the opportunity for them to mingle with senior managers, but it's not one-on-one. And this is going to sound flip. Almost every story that I have ever heard involves a car. Like, don't get in a car. I mean, you shouldn't have an intern in your car, and as an intern, you probably don't want to be in a circumstance where you're in a car
Not about
with
absolutes,
somebody.
but certainly safeguards, right? Think about what are those safeguard measures that we can take to avoid some of those pitfalls.
And I think it's okay, man or woman superior, to be overly cautious. That's the era we're in right now. And so I think it's, people have said to me, this idea like, well, now I can't do anything. Now I can't go out and have a cup of coffee. And it's going to take a while before the dust settles on what the responsibility is. But until that happens, I think it's okay to be a little bit on your heels when you think about when and where you will interact with a young person.
As long as it's not, and of course this isn't what you're saying, but as long as it's not managers who may be predominantly men saying, well, in the past, I was willing to mentor female interns, but now, given the climate, I'm nervous that could be perceived as something that could be problematic. When you're still being professional in a professional setting, you can have meetings in an office with an open door. There are other ways, that you can meet and mentor and advise interns of either gender without having these concerns.
And I think that's where women need to step up.
Yes.
Because if that is something that's going to be a short-term issue and negative, then we as women in senior positions of power at any network or any news organization can step in.
But I think we need to push back really hard against that sort of narrative or that complaint that, oh, now, I'm not going to hire any female interns. I'm not going to be in a room alone with them, or young workers who are women or anything like that, because they feel like that's going to put them on the spot.
I did have someone tell me recently that he had a colleague who said, I'm not going to get into an elevator with a woman alone anymore because I have a lot of money and I know that I might get sued. And I just stopped and said, if we brought all the women in the room together and said, would you like to tell us a story about harassment, we'd get a lot of stories. If we brought the men in and said, would you like to tell us about the false accusations, we probably wouldn't get that many. And statistically, from the EEOC, at least with regard to sexual assault, the predominance of false accusations, it's low.
Right, because it's, as we've been talking about, it's so incredibly difficult for people to come forward in the first place. It's a huge risk and a gamble. So the percentage of people who are coming forward with a false accusation in the hope of getting some huge payout is incredibly small.
Well, and I think the other thing that we have to do, and again, this is one of those places where we fell short originally. I think we went to the path of least resistance. We would do a little bit of intern training, but did we spend enough time training managers of interns? And I think that's the other piece of it. Now that you've got someone who's new to the workforce, what does mentoring look like in a different form? How do you need to have conversations with them? You actually do need to say to them, I've just told you that you have the option to work from home or go on this story. Do you understand what that means? Are you comfortable doing that? Or is this a new concept for you? And you're like, I don't really know what to do with that, right? Someone who's been in the workforce for a while understands those things. And sometimes the people that we ask to manage an intern haven't worked with someone at the beginning of their career in a while. And we've got to remind them. And so this becomes a part of that.
And that same advice applies to any individual who becomes a new supervisor for the first time or takes on an additional management role. So it really has benefits well beyond the interns.
Yeah. So you have the interesting position of being the only man on this panel. So I want to give you the most important opportunity of all. Give advice on how a man can be a good mentor to a female intern.
Wow. I think you should focus on the craft, and I think it's important that you don't personalize the experience where there might be some blurry lines in terms of how you communicate. I think asking other women for ideas about best ways to approach women. Women know women best.
You've mentored lots of people. What has worked
really
well
important
for you as you've been a mentor?
For me, it's been my focus has always been on their career development, and I've just managed to stay very focused on that, pointing them, seeing myself more as a road mapper, which is kind of old-fashioned, I guess, the app now, and helping them to really navigate around the environment that they're in, making sure that I am available to answer questions. I think making sure that they understand that there are layers of oversight, there is ownership of their experience within our newsroom environment, I think is really important. And then also I just think encouraging and sort of being a bridge that doesn't just keep the focus one-on-one, but ultimately it's about ability to network. So making sure that I am sharing them, the experiences that they are with others in the newsroom who can help, listening a lot, answering their questions. I think it's what we all, I think it's probably no different from the values that we think about with any other mentorship. And I just think it's important in conversations like this that when students come on board that they see people who look like them, who they feel most comfortable with. I was talking with an intern fairly recently and sharing that I was going to be on this panel just to get an intern's perspective. And one of the things that she said was often welcoming and inviting for her was seeing other females. And I hear this from journalists of color too. When you see people who look like you, who may have some shared experiences, I think organically it's a lot easier to have those connections. But I think I think for me it's figuring out
and it doesn't
what their
mean you don't
interests
ask them
are.
about their families, or they may even tell you about their boyfriend, but it's not because you want to know anything in particular detail about beyond the fact that they have a boyfriend.
It's following the same safeguard precautions that we've been talking about, I think is the way to do it. And there are lots of men who do it and do it well.
Amen.
We are talking about pretty large organizations, all of you who have a pretty good system. A lot of people don't have the benefit of even an HR person in their workplace. So it's very important to have training materials available to you, and we thank our guests for helping provide this one. And when we come back, Power to the Interns continues with the student view.